Hello friends. Uh, as we know that a financial system of a country comprises of four components: financial institutions, financial services, instruments, and financial market. First component of financial system is financial institutions, and these financial institutions further categorized divided into banks, banking institutions, on non-banking institutions. In banking institutions, these are the intermediaries which play a role between the saver and borrower. Friends, today we will talk about the Indian banking structure. The banking system of a country indicates the financial health of that economy or economic soundness of that country. Friends, Indian banking system, it is regulated by the Reserve Bank of India. Reserve Bank of India is the apex bank, or it is also called Bank of Bankers. All banks are regulated by the Reserve Bank of India. Reserve Bank of India was as Reserve Bank of India Act was passed in 1934, and Reserve Bank of India started its working on 1st April 1935. Friends, banks are generally two types: scheduled banks and non-scheduled banks. Scheduled banks are those banks which are listed in the second schedule of RBI Act 1934, and non-scheduled banks are those banks which are not scheduled, not listed in the second schedule of RBI Act 1934. Friends, there is a difference between RBI Act 1934 and RBI Act was passed in 1934, and RBI commenced its business from 1st April 1935, and the banks which are listed in the second schedule of RBI Act 1934 are scheduled banks, and which are not listed in the second schedule of RBI Act 1934 are called non-scheduled banks. We can divide the Indian banks in two categories: scheduled banks and non-scheduled banks. Further, scheduled banks are further divided in two types: commercial banks and cooperative banks. Friends, commercial banks, we can say their objective is to earn profit by this banking business, and commercial business banks are further four types: public sector banks owned by the government, private sector banks owned by the private shareholders, not by the government. Foreign banks, their ownership of the foreign banks is in the hands of the foreign nations. Regional rural banks, they also comes under the they owned by the government. They are jointly owned by the central government, state government, and sponsored bank. We will discuss one by one all these types of the banks. Friends, public sector banks further three types: SBI and SBI Associates, State Bank of India and its associate. Before the merger, State Bank of Patiala, State Bank of Bikaner, these were the associates of SBI, but at present all associate banks merged with the State Bank of India. Then nationalized banks. Friends, nationalized banks are those banks which were private banks before 1969, but Srimati Indira Gandhi nationalized these banks. 14 banks were nationalized in 1969, and further 6 banks nationalized later on 1980. Friends, these banks are Punjab National Bank, Bank of Baroda, Allahabad Bank, Dena Bank, etc. Now, other sector public banks which were not nationalized, which were already in the hands of the ownership was in the hands of the government. Second type of the scheduled bank is cooperative banks. Cooperative banks generally lend the money to the weaker section of the society, and these cooperative banks do not give the loan directly to the individuals. They give the loan to the members of the cooperative society or to the cooperative societies. These works at the state cooperative banks, district cooperative banks, and other cooperative banks like urban cooperative bank and rural cooperative. This is the structure of Indian banking system. Further, we will explain one by one. Friends, first we will talk about the scheduled banks. Scheduled banks which are included in the second schedule of RBI Act 1934. Scheduled banks, the eligibility criteria of these banks, the minimum paid up capital must be rupees 5 lakh and does not harm the interest of the depositors. Example of the scheduled banks, scheduled commercial banks like state, all our public sector banks, private sector banks, foreign banks, RRVs, they are the scheduled banks. Even almost all cooperative banks, most of the cooperative banks, they comes under the scheduled banks. And scheduled banks definition is their name must be in the second schedule of RBI Act 1934, and they must have minimum paid up capital of rupees 5 lakh and does not harm the interest of depositors. And second type of the bank is non-scheduled banks. Non-scheduled banks which are not included in the list of second schedule of RBI Act 1934. Friends, non-scheduled banks are not allowed to borrow money from RBI for regular or banking purposes. These non-scheduled banks are exempted from various rules, various terms and conditions imposed by the Reserve Bank of India on scheduled banks. Non-scheduled banks are the banks which do not comply the rules specified by the RBI, or say the banks which do not come under the category of scheduled banks. Friends, the area of operations is of non-scheduled banks is very small. These work in very local areas and their limited branches and very started with very small capital. Some examples of non-scheduled banks: Andaman Nicobar State Cooperative Bank, Arunachal Pradesh State Cooperative Apex Bank Limited, Assam Cooperative Apex Bank Limited, Chandigarh State Cooperative Bank Limited, J&K State Cooperative Bank. It doesn't mean that all cooperative banks are non-scheduled banks. Friends, most of the cooperative banks are scheduled banks. Now, the commercial banks, their objective is to earn profit from banking business. Commercial banks, their name suggests, they are doing their banking business to earn profit. Now, if we talk about the types of the commercial banks, for already it has shown in the structure of Indian banking system. Now, further, we will I will tell you with the examples. Public sector banks, the ownership is in the hand of the government. Friends, whenever the word comes public sector means the ownership is in the hands of the government. The property belongs to public. Public means government. So the banks which are owned by the government is the owner of these banks. Example of these banks: SBI, PNB, Allahabad Bank, and all nationalized banks, they are owned by the government. Now, the private sector banks, friends, private sector banks, they are owned by the shareholders, not by the government. Private shareholders have the ownership of these private banks. In Indian, some example of some Indian private sector banks: ICICI Bank, HDFC Bank, Yes Bank, Kotak Mahindra Bank. These are the some examples of the private Indian private banks. Now the foreign banks. Friends, foreign banks, the ownership is in the hands of the foreign countries. Foreign banks. HSBC Bank, Hong Kong Shanghai Bank Corporation, Citibank, RBS, Royal Bank of Scotland. These are the banks called the foreign banks. But all these banks, whether the private sector banks, foreign banks, or public sector banks, they have to follow the rules and regulations made by the Reserve Bank of India. RRBs. Friends, RRBs are the regional rural bank, Kshetriya Gramin banks. These banks are regulated by the RBI, but further they are regulated by the NABARD, National Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development. Friends, the objective of these regional rural banks is to provide the loans to the rural areas for rural people, especially the farmers for farming purposes. And but they are the public sector banks. They are owned jointly by the central government, state government, and sponsored bank. This sponsored bank is generally a public sector bank. Now, the example of these banks, Grameen Bank of Aryabharat is a bank which is functioning in the central and western UP. Now, friends, the cooperative banks, as its name suggests, cooperative. In Hindi, they are called Sahakari banks. For cooperative banks, they are the banks which are formed under the Cooperative Societies Act, but they are the banks. Cooperative bank is a financial entity which belongs to its members who are at the same time the owners and customers of their bank. Friends, they are formed by their members, cooperative members, and they are owned by the members. And even the loan is provided to these members of cooperative societies. Cooperative banks in India, they are registered under the State Cooperative Societies Act. Cooperative banks also regulated by the RBI, and they are governed by the Banking Regulation Act 1949 and Banking Laws Cooperative Societies Act 1955. Cooperative banks are the banks, their main objective is to provide the financial assistance to the poor section of the society. Friends, some example of the cooperative banks, district cooperative banks, their area of operations at district level, state cooperative banks, their area of operations at state level, rural cooperative bank, they work at the in the rural areas, and urban cooperative bank. Friends, you have heard the name of a bank, Punjab Maharashtra Cooperative Bank, PMC. Their area of operations was at Punjab and Maharashtra states, and there was some problems in the functioning of the PMC. Okay, friends, I gave you the overview of the Indian banking structure. Further, I will cover one by one in the separate lectures. I will cover Reserve Bank of India and commercial banks in separate lectures. Okay, thank you. Keep watching.